So, Salam Alaikum. Welcome to iccnc for the launch of the second season of Islam and Authors. We're so glad you can make it here. And we're very pleased to have you here, Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr. We've been talking about his book, In Search of the Sacred, conversation with Seyyed Hossein Nasr on his life and thought. So, Dr. Nasr, welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I've not lectured in this hall for over 4 years now. Very glad to be back in San Francisco. And I apologize, 3 years ago I was supposed to give a major lecture here. I'm sure many of you were planning to come, but my late mother died on the way to my coming here, and I was not able to come. So I apologize after all these years, and I'm very glad to be able to come to see you here, Miss Friends.
Well, wonderful. Well, the divine will moves in mysterious ways. So thank you again for coming here. And it was a great pleasure to read this book. You've written so many books on so many different topics, but this seems to stand out from your corpus. This is your first autobiographically themed book, right?
I tried throughout my life never to write an autobiography. In fact, as the great Indian scholar Ananda Kumaraswamy said, he said, I want to become not someone but no one. But one has to be someone in order to become no one. Sooner or later, one gets stuck with the responsibility of having to write about oneself. But until I came to America, I assiduously avoided that, except one short essay when I was chosen as a member of the International Institute of Philosophy, which is like the International Academy of Philosophy in Paris, International Institut de Philosophie. I had to write a little biography of myself to be delivered in Vienna, which I did, but it's a short essay in French. That was it. Then came the Library of Living Philosophers, which came out in 2001, dedicated to my humble thought, and one of the requirements was to have an intellectual autobiography, which I wrote. And I thought that would be the end of the road. Many of my friends, students, have asked me to write my spiritual autobiography, and I have not written it. I said if I ever would write that, I would write it in Persian, and they would have to translate it into English, but it has not been written. And then Ramin Jahanbegloo, who is an Iranian philosopher, who also happens to be my cousin, but that's secondary. He lived in Paris for some 20 years with a professor of philosophy there, and he started a collection which in France is much more popular than the United States, in a collection of what the French call conversation, sort of discourse, conversations with various people, and had done with Paul Ricoeur, the most famous French philosopher of the day, who since then has died, and Isaiah Berlin, the great Oxford professor of history and philosophy of history, who has also died, and both of these books became very famous. He called me up and he said, Hossein, I would like to do one with you. Since he was my cousin, I couldn't say no. I said, all right. So he came to Washington from Paris, and he spent about 3 weeks doing this interview with me, which is the foundation of this book. It was all on tapes, and it came out and it was transcribed in Iran from the tape. It's like transcribing Tamil in the hills of hillbilly country in Louisiana or somewhere. It was horrible, absolutely horrible, the transcription, but they translated that into Persian, nevertheless. And it became a bestseller. It's been a bestseller in Iran for the last 3 or 4 years. It's going to 7th printing in Persian language in Tehran. But the English was left to me. Ramin went to Iran and he got into trouble, and then it's now University of Toronto. But I did all the work of trying to prepare this for publication in English, because I thought people in the English-speaking world should be able to have access to it and not do it in Persian. I called my dear friend Houston Smith. He had a book like this with the University of California Press, which he brought out. He said, why don't you approach them? And I approached them. They did not show much interest because this book did not have footnotes in it at the beginning. It was a book of conversations. And it has so many figures from Iranian prime ministers to Martin Heidegger. You know, nobody knows who all these people are. So they said they had to be footnoted, and I spent a year of my life just annotating and footnoting the work. And finally, Prager, a major publisher in New York, has brought it out finally after over a decade. And the title, In Search of the Sacred, was suggested by Ramin Janbaglu. In Persian, is that Justujuye Amr Qudsi. It's a very nice Persian title. The Persian title I chose myself, the translation, but the actual English title was suggested by him.
Yeah, I think the book really gets into the depth of your thought on the other hand, but it maintains somewhat of an informal air at some points, especially discussing your childhood. So the question I'd like to ask is, as you look back and reflect on your childhood, is there a particular moment or particular personality that you can identify who really played the event or the person played a big role in launching you on this search for the sacred?
You're right. This book is really comprised of two parts. The first part deals with autobiography, more or less, and not only with my own life, but with events in Tehran going back to time of Reza Shah and some of the momentous events that took place during the Second World War and the interaction between the Islamic world and the West and so forth. The last part of the book is really distilling of my philosophical thought. All the questions are posed are deeply philosophical questions, and rather than reading books like Knowledge and the Sacred and Into the Sacred Science or Art and Spirituality, books which deal with these issues in a very intellectual way, this deals with them in a somewhat simpler manner. As for the second part of your question, I think anyone who reads even my intellectual biography in the Library of Living Philosophers, the person in my childhood who most influenced me was without doubt my father. Without doubt. He was my first teacher. He was, first of all, one of Iran's greatest scholars. He was president of university, dean of several faculties. He was a doctor, both traditional Islamic doctor and modern doctor, modern Western medicine. He was a great master of the Persian language. The greatest teachers of master Persian language would come to our house to ask questions of him. He was also a political figure for many years, was in the first parliament of Iran, was Minister of Education for a long time. So our house was really a place where from prime ministers to ulama to Sufi masters, everybody would come and go. It was really quite an incredible place. And he was my first teacher. He was the first person, most of all, to teach me ethics. When I was a little child, and they would bring around, let's say, a bowl of 10 oranges. He would say, Hossein, always take the smallest one. Leave the bigger one for others. The child always wants to grab the biggest orange in the bowl. No, so the first discipline of the nafs that I later on tried in my life to cultivate was given by him. And also intellectually, he was the one person who put in me the love for knowledge. Perhaps God put it there, but anyway, he was the one who actualized it. So from the time I was a little child, I took great joy in knowing. Nothing else really interested me, even when I was 5 years old. So he had the central role to play.
I'm sure the love of beauty also. Aesthetics.
Yes, the love of beauty actually comes to a large extent, not only from him, but from my childhood ambience. I came from an aristocratic family in Iran. We had wonderful, beautiful carpets and things like that. At that time, Tehran was not so modernized, especially the first few years of my life. I lived in an old quarter of the city.
Very quaint neighborhood.
That's right. The streets were very narrow, beautiful mosque behind us, holy fountain. You visit the Islamic world, you know, water fountains become center of devotion and so forth. Like in Morocco, we had that in Iran. And I saw a great deal of beauty. I mean, the greatest calligrapher of Iran at that time was my student, my father. He would always come to our house, and the reason I can write fairly well is because I had to spend 5 hours a day practicing calligraphy when I was a little child. And so they emphasized upon beauty, and not only visual beauty, but oral beauty.